As Joe Biden accepted the Democratic nomination last night, President Trump levied attacks against his opponent. In a tweet, the president said Joe Biden has done none of the things he says he has. Mr. Trump also called into Fox News and spoke near Biden's hometown yesterday, continuing his critique of his policy positions. Paula Reid is standing by for us at the White House and joins us now to discuss. So, Paula, what themes is the president using when criticizing Biden?
Well, he has a few that he continues to circle back to. One is chaos. Another is questions about Joe Biden's mental acuity. And then the fact that Joe Biden is arguably a career politician. So on chaos, yesterday in Scranton, the president really painted a very dark picture for suburban voters, suggesting that if Joe Biden is elected, that their suburban communities will look a lot like, quote, the violent anarchy of Portland, the blood-stained sidewalks of Chicago, and the smoldering ruins in Minneapolis. To hear the president trying to convince suburban voters that if he does not get a second term, that there will be chaos and violence in the streets. Both the Vice President Mike Pence and the president insist that they are the, quote, law and order candidates. The president made an interesting analogy, Vlad. He said that he is, quote, like a wall, that he is the only thing standing between their families, the voters he was speaking to yesterday in Pennsylvania, and a radical left-wing mob. He also likes to call into question Joe Biden's mental faculties. He, of course, calls him Sleepy Joe. He suggests he is nowhere near as intelligent as his previous rival, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and just questions whether he's up to the job. He's also now tweeting and releasing ads about the fact that Joe Biden was in Washington for decades and calling attention to many of the policies that were implemented during that time and suggesting very much as he did in 2016 that he is sort of the anti-swamp creature, if you will, that he's not a career politician and that you need someone like him, Donald Trump, not someone like Joe Biden, to continue to fight for voters here in D.C. These tend to be his three main pitches to voters right now.
So, Paula, as you know, we spoke with you yesterday morning as we were learning that former Trump advisor Steve Bannon had been arrested. Bannon appeared in court yesterday. What's the latest in his case? What's he saying about the indictment?
It was fascinating, Vlad. Yesterday, as Bannon emerged from the federal courthouse in Manhattan, he addressed a very rowdy group outside the court, and he suggested that this case against him, which was brought by the Trump Justice Department, that this was all part of an effort to prevent him from building a wall. But reviewing the facts of this case, prosecutors allege that he was part of a group that fundraised over $25 million to build a border wall along the southern border. But instead of using that donor money for that purpose, instead they funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars to themselves, to enrich themselves. Bannon pleaded not guilty yesterday to charges including wire fraud and money laundering. He was released on $5 million bond. But again, this is the sixth associate of the president who's been criminally charged by the Trump Justice Department during this administration.
Yeah, that is what is remarkable to me, Paula, that the president of the United States can sit in front of television cameras and reporters and say that President Obama was the most corrupt administration ever and have these six associates, as you just mentioned, who have been caught up in all these legal entanglements. And the vice president, Mike Pence, he appeared on CBS this morning, as you know, and our colleague, Tony DeCopel, asked him about Bannon's arrest. I want to play some of what he had to say.
Steve Bannon yesterday became one of 6 close associates of the president to be criminally charged during his administration. You're campaigning as the law and order administration, draining the swamp. Does this string of criminal charges undercut that message?
Well, no, I don't think so. And Steve Bannon certainly deserves his day in court. I don't know any more about it than what I've seen in the news, or that President Trump actually denounced that effort months ago. I think one of the great accomplishments of this administration is after Democrats like Joe Biden opposed our effort to build a wall on the southern border that the American people voted for, with a crisis of illegal immigration across this country, the president used his executive power to secure resources.
Yeah, he says he doesn't know anything about it, Paula. He says he doesn't know anything about QAnon. The question, of course, becomes, how do these charges against the president's associates impact the administration? How does it impact voters and, more importantly, the campaign?
Well, as we noted, 6 of the president's top advisors have been criminally charged by the president's own Justice Department. He likes to try to diminish or undermine the credibility of investigations that have occurred during this administration by calling them a Democratic hoax. But again, yesterday's case, that was approved by his Attorney General, William Barr. He knew about this prosecution. It went forward. The previous 5 have all been prosecuted by current and former attorneys general. And these were not minor players. I mean, this was the president's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, former deputy campaign chairman, Rick Gates, former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn, his former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, and of course his longtime friend and associate, Roger Stone. I've covered all of these cases, Vlad, and the one thing they all have in common is that the charges, they don't have a lot of variety. They tend to center around fraud and lying or trying to obstruct investigations. So far, there's other 5 associates who have been prosecuted. They have all pleaded guilty and or been convicted on these charges. And it raises questions about whether the president is, as he promised to on the campaign trail, hiring, quote, the best people. It raises questions about the character of the people around the president. But also, Vlad, this comes in a week where a Republican-led committee, the Senate Intelligence Committee, released a report that assesses that the president may have given false statements to the special counsel. So for voters heading into November, there are questions about whether they would be voting for another term, which would include a lot of questions about possible obstruction, possible corruption. And again, there are some legitimate questions about the kind of people the president has surrounded himself with. And we're only talking right now about the ones who have been formally charged, not people like his other personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, who have come under scrutiny from federal prosecutors.
Important observations and reporting there, Paula. Yes, hashtag drain the swamp indeed. Now, let me ask you about some new CBS News polling regarding the Postal Service. It found that 59% of Americans support more funding for the Postal Service. It's always struck me as interesting that the president and some of his allies attack the Postal Service when most Americans seem to support the Postal Service. They support mail carriers. You know, it's not just voting. It's people who are older, who get their medication, who receive their Social Security check. When I was on lockdown here in the epicenter of New York City, the only person that we saw other than each other in my apartment was the mail carrier who every day showed up with letters, outside communication from the rest of the world. And we thanked her every single day that we ran into her because she was an essential worker. And while we were all locked down, she was working, as were all the other mail carriers across the country. So when you see polling like that, it doesn't surprise me. What are you hearing is the latest on the fight over that funding?
Well, we know this weekend Democrats are expected to vote in favor of about $25 billion in additional funding for the post office. But just, of course, because Democrats in the House vote for it doesn't mean it's actually going to happen. The White House Republicans, they have signaled that they may be willing to support some of that if it's part of a larger stimulus deal that can resolve some of these other outstanding questions about additional economic relief in the wake of COVID. But so far, we've seen really almost no ability on the two sides to compromise on a lot of the key issues there. So it's not clear the post office will actually get that money. But Vlad, while the Postal Service, they have been, certainly our postal workers have been critical workers during COVID. Fact is, the larger business model that they work within has been losing billions of dollars a year. It is something that needs to be addressed, though in the immediate, the next couple months, the focus is on having an unprecedented number of people potentially be mailing in their ballots and how to support that.
Looking ahead, Paula, let me ask you about the RNC. One of the things that I find really interesting as we talk about the Postal Service is Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, gave an interview to Reuters yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, and he was asked repeatedly about this issue. And I'm just going to quote one of the things Leader McConnell said. I don't think the American people need to worry about the election. It's going to occur on time, safely and credibly. So it strikes me that there's this disconnect. You got the president saying one thing to news cameras and to reporters, and you have the Senate Majority Leader saying another. And I know that there was some discussion as to whether or not he was even going to tape record a speech for the RNC. Turns out he is. But what are you hearing about that disconnect, if there is one, between the Senate Majority Leader and President Trump?
Look, the Senate Majority Leader, one of the most powerful people in Washington, President Trump, they have not been on the same page over the past few months, particularly when you saw the two sides negotiating economic stimulus. The White House would insist, for example, on funding for a new FBI building, something that could potentially benefit the president's nearby hotel. Mitch McConnell, you remember that press conference? He wanted nothing to do with that. He threw the White House right under the bus on that. It was clear that they really just weren't on the same page on a lot of issues. Now, this issue of election security, the president has repeatedly tried to sow doubts about the integrity of the election, particularly when it comes to mail-in votes. The White House has not been able to confirm that the president will accept the outcome of this election if he loses, that he wants to see what happens. Mr. McConnell is just not willing, appears to not be willing to really endorse this messaging to undermine the credibility of the election. He's putting some distance between himself and the president, even though the two men have been on the same page and have actually been very effective in working together on issues, particularly stacking the courts with conservative judges, something they've both been in lockstep on. But here, when it comes to election security, the Senate Majority Leader is just not willing to engage in some of the tactics President Trump has taken to attack the Postal Service, but also really to attack the credibility of the election that's coming up.
Yeah, it's just so interesting, Paula, because this is sort of reading the tea leaves, but you mentioned a couple of those things, right? The president is saying that the election is going to be rigged and that, there's going to be piles of ballots. He pointed to some area off camera where ballots are going to be placed. And then you've got the Senate Majority Leader saying the election is going to be safe, it's going to be secure. You've got Kayleigh McEnany not willing to say whether or not the president will accept the results of the election, and Republicans are not talking and using that kind of language. And you've got the president praising Marjorie Taylor Greene, a politician who believes in this QAnon stuff. And you've got Republicans saying, no, this is not the future of the Republican Party. So there does seem to be, a couple of instances where finally Republicans are starting to say, we're going to distance ourselves from some of the rhetoric that the president is using. But again, we'll learn, I guess, more as we look to the RNC next week. Paula Reid, always great to have you, Paula. Thank you so much.